Welcome to part 3 of the Unbridled Discussion series, To Observe Horses is to Know Horses. I hope you have enjoyed the series so far because I saved the best for last. You now know that horses use synchronization and mirroring to create and express emotional connection. And you also understand that having control over their own personal space is something horses value immensely. Now it's time to dig even deeper and answer the question, what role does touch play in the natural lives of horses? For those who may be joining me for the first time, I'm Kim Hallin, president of Unbridled LLC, located just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. You can learn more about me and my work at www.unbridled.guru. I'm pretty excited because today's information is likely to rock your world as it did mine. For me, these realizations resulted in a complete paradigm shift in terms of how I relate to my horses, when I touch them, and how I touch them. As humans, we are generally inclined to think about touch primarily as a means for expressing affection. But we also have to acknowledge that not all kinds of touch we humans give and receive is offered with love or kindness. Overall, though, I think it's safe to say that humans most often use touch to express positive emotions. We also sometimes use touch for teaching purposes or to guide and support someone else. Examples of this are when a coach supports a gymnast or an instructor teaches a dance lesson. When it comes to building healthy relationships, the most important thing about touch is that it's mutually accepted and appreciated. And it should be no different in regard to our relationships with our horses. So, in order to understand what kinds of touch horses appreciate and understand most, it only makes sense to begin by looking at how they use touch with one another. After spending a great deal of time observing my own horses as they interact with one another, I've come to realize that there are 3 primary things we need to understand about how horses use touch. The first is this. In the overall scheme of things, horses don't actually touch one another very often. They rely much more on body language, energy, intention, and the use of space to communicate how they feel in any given moment or toward any given individual. Second, when horses do touch one another, it is often not a type of touch we humans would appreciate being on the receiving end of. And thirdly, horses use touch mostly for very practical reasons. For example, to accomplish or communicate something specific. And only occasionally do they use touch to express affection or emotional connection. I'm now going to explain the 8 most common reasons horses use touch. The order in which I've listed these is not necessarily indicative of any priority or rate of frequency. The determining factor in regard to how frequently any of these behaviors occur for any specific individual is simply how often the correlated situation occurs. Number 1, horses use touch to investigate objects, people, and other animals at close range. This typically involves touching the object of interest with their nose and sniffing it. But when a horse starts to feel really confident and curious, it might also paw and explore the object with its feet, or even stick its head all the way inside something, or pick an object up with its mouth to play with it. A critical thing to remember is that horses often touch objects with their whiskers first. Did you know that equine whiskers are a result of millions of years of evolution to help horses sense their environment? The whiskers, both around a horse's eyes and muzzle, are extremely sensitive and have a very rich nerve supply. In fact, each individual whisker has a region of the sensory cortex dedicated specifically to it. Horses have several blind spots, including at the tip of their nose, underneath their jaw and head, at their poll, and at the center of their forehead. So horses rely on whiskers as well as their hearing to gather information and send messages back to the brain to help them sort out whether an object under investigation is safe and or how to navigate around it so as to avoid injury. Unbeknownst to many people, when we clip our horses' whiskers, we actually cripple their ability to receive information in this important way. Number 2, Horses use touch to sniff greetings. Among horses, this behavior is primarily about exchanging breath and scent, but horses do touch one another lightly, including with their whiskers, during these moments of connection. And horses don't just exhibit this behavior when meeting someone new. Old friends also do it after being temporarily separated, and even herd mates will sometimes do it briefly just to check in during the day. Number 3, mares use touch to communicate with their foals. This includes licking to clean, nudging to support, protect, and direct. And the foals will use suckling to nurse. In the early hours and the first days after birth, the mare will frequently nudge and encourage the foal with her nose. Number 4, horses use touch to express hormonally driven behaviors related to mating. It's important to note that these behaviors play out very differently in domestic settings than how they play out in wild horse herds, primarily because the majority of domestic male horses have been castrated or gelded, while female horses are left intact. And yet many mares spend most of their domestic lives neither pregnant nor nursing. What this means is that all of our domestic horses are left coping with very imbalanced and unnatural hormonal dynamics. In my own multi-sex herd, courting behaviors occur only in relation to my newest gelding. When mares live with a familiar gelding for a long time, as my two have with my older gelding, they typically stop going into season. But any changes to a herd's makeup, including the addition even of a new mare, can re-trigger hormonal behaviors, which typically include nuzzling, following very close, possessiveness, and touching and sniffing one another. But it can also involve more emotional behaviors like nipping, striking, and kicking, as well as mounting. Horses that live at boarding facilities often have to deal with changing dynamics, not only maybe in their own paddock mates, but in neighboring paddocks as well. So these changes can affect hormonally driven behaviors. Number 5, horses sometimes use touch to reinforce personal space boundaries. As I explained in part 2 of this series, the vast majority of the time, horses in a harmonious herd are able to communicate about personal space boundaries in very polite and calm ways. But at times, and especially when herd makeup changes suddenly, more dramatic behaviors like biting and kicking can result. The photo on the left here was taken when I first introduced Marcus, the big gray, into my herd. Marcus was not well socialized and did not understand some key things about herd dynamics. This was very unsettling to Shoki, who initially worked really hard to keep Marcus at a distance from the rest of the herd. The photo on the right was taken the day I reintroduced my then yearling Tempo back into my herd after she was weaned. She immediately tried to return to her old comfort behavior of nursing, so her mom, Puck, had to be quite firm in reinforcing the new rules and boundaries of their relationship. Number 6, male horses will use touch to fight or to play fight. Serious fighting between horses versus a discussion about personal space boundaries typically only happens between stallions that are hormonally driven to protect or acquire a herd of mares. This kind of fighting between stallions is usually a face-to-face battle that involves lunging, biting, rearing, striking, pushing, and or bumping chests, or even climbing on top of one another. It can also involve kicking with the hind feet, but this is more of a defensive behavior. When it comes to geldings who live together, or even young wild stallions living in a bachelor band, they use playful or mock fighting to develop combat skills, but it's in a more friendly way. You can see and feel the difference in energy and intensity between the photo at the top left with wild stallions who are truly fighting, and the other two photos showing pairs of domestic gelding friends who are play fighting. Number 7, closely bonded horses will touch to mutual groom. This is a very specific type of touch that is unrelated to hormonal attraction, although it does require a high level of trust and intimacy. The purpose behind this mutual grooming behavior is both practical, my mares often do it when they're itchy, and also an expression of close friendship. Of my 4 horses, there are only 2 who mutual groom. Whenever 2 horses participate in this shared activity, they are communicating back and forth at a very sophisticated and intimate level, sharing detailed information about exactly what kind of touch feels good and where. Number 8, Horses will use touch to scratch, swat, or rub an itch, especially related to pesky bugs. They will not only rub on various objects within reach, but will sometimes also rub on one another, or use their tails to collaborate in swatting flies. So now that we've reviewed the 8 primary ways horses use touch, it makes sense to think about whether or not we would want our horses to touch us in those same ways. Speaking for myself, out of the 8 types of touch described, I only appreciate being on the receiving end of a few, and even then, only if the touch is offered very politely. Excuse me. It's also important for us to acknowledge that rarely does touch offered between horses or among horses involve sensitive, vulnerable areas of the body, including the eyes, forehead, ears, belly, girth area, spine, tail, or feet. And yet these very vulnerable areas of the body are the ones we most frequently want or need to touch, either with our hands or with our grooming, riding, and training tools. In fact, when we humans first meet or approach a horse, we often automatically reach directly for their faces with our hands, especially if they approach to get a closer look or extend their noses toward us to investigate or sniff a greeting. Furthermore, we often reach straight for their blind spots. We also never think twice about expecting horses to willingly let us attach halters and bridles to their faces or put bits in their mouths. We place saddles on their backs, girths around their bellies, and shoes or boots on their feet. None of this is in any way, shape, or form a natural sort of touch to a horse. Not only does it take time and care to help them feel safe accepting these kinds of touch, some horses are never able to receive it without some hesitation, especially if it was introduced to them without empathy for how it made them feel. Simply thinking about things from the horse's perspective and point of view can help us develop a great deal more empathy in our approach to touching them. I also like to practice remembering how it feels to me when someone tries to touch me in a way or on a part of my body where I'm not particularly comfortable being touched in that moment. In an effort to be more thoughtful and kind, I now try to make a habit of always asking my horses for permission before I reach for them, or when possible, to actually let the horse take the lead on initiating touch, or in letting me know that touch is not okay right now. This way, I can be much more confident that my touch will be appreciated when I do offer it. The most important thing to our horse always is our willingness to listen and to understand what it feels like to be vulnerable. When our horses try to tell us they aren't comfortable being touched, or at least not with the way we're doing it in the moment, we should be able to respond with compassion, not disappointment, and certainly not punishment. The good news is when our horse does tell us no, we can use this feedback to begin a conversation with them about why they don't want to be touched in that moment, thus learning valuable information about their preferences for future reference. This is what builds trust and intimacy in any relationship. For me, and for most of the students I work with, the hardest part about changing these habits is to simply stop assuming that horses will or should like to be touched the way we want or need to touch them, and instead to try and remember to look to the horse to tell us how they're feeling about it. It's important to genuinely care how our horses feel about our touch and to understand that the ways we use touch are foreign to them. I find that thinking about it in this way helps pull me out of my own agenda-driven tendencies. It requires me to get present in the moment and to adjust my approach according to my horse's response. This way, even when I have to touch my horses in order to get something done, I can at least do it with a more compassionate and patient heart. And I've noticed a huge difference in how my horses respond to me since I've started focusing more intentionally on this. Now, some of you may be wondering, how can I know for sure if or when my touch feels good to my horse? So let's start by going over some of the key indicators horses commonly use to communicate that they don't like the way they're being touched. Here are some of the early or subtle indicators you can watch for. A horse swishing its tail, especially in a sudden, fast, or emotional way. And I found that mares are especially vocal with their tails, but geldings also communicate with their tails as well. So pay special attention anytime your horse's tail movement coincides directly with your touch. When this happens, chances are It's a direct response to your touch. So if they are moving or leaning away from the touch, either with their whole body or a specific part of their body, this is another early indicator. So even if your horse's ears are forward, if he looks away from you when you touch him, this is important feedback to take note of. Also, if they have tension in any part of their body or face, including a worried or concerned facial expression. All of these are subtle indicators you can look for. Now, if you don't notice the subtle indicators, then they're going to move into more obvious indicators. And these are much easier to recognize, but unfortunately, they also mean we've probably missed the more subtle indicators and that our horse's level of frustration is increasing. So if we see any of these, it's time to really stop and listen to what our horse is trying to say. One of them is if they pin their ears in response to our touch. Another is if they start pawing. This behavior most often happens when a horse is tied or constrained and feels it cannot avoid a touch that is either happening or that it knows is coming. Another indicator is if a horse is evading or bracing against a touch, such as evading the feel of a bit in their mouth or bracing against pressure. If we ignore or try to push through both the early indicators and then the more obvious signals from our horse, the horse is really left with no choice except to either shut down emotionally and just go on autopilot, which isn't good, or to start screaming with its behavior in an attempt to wake us up and out of our stupor to pay attention. Of course, neither of those are good, but I actually prefer if a horse starts screaming because then at least they're still trying to communicate, and I think they believe that maybe we're going to listen. So screaming behaviors, they're pretty much impossible to ignore, but they include nipping or biting, bolting, kicking, bucking, and rearing. So learning to look for the early indicators and also learning not to blame or punish our horse when it tries to tell us we're not listening and they're going up the escalation. Both of these are good ways to avoid causing your horse to feel the need to hit this level of yelling or screaming. Now let's go over some of the key indicators horses use to say, yes, that kind of touch feels great. A horse that voluntarily moves toward you or into the touch you're offering is definitely saying yes. When they also try to rub on us, this most likely means they're feeling itchy and are asking if we can use our touch to help them versus just to pet them without a meaningful purpose. Now remember, touch that doesn't have a purpose or function is not naturally meaningful to horses. You can also watch your horse's facial expression because these can get quite dramatic when a touch feels really good to them. Most often, this happens when we offer to rub or scratch them in a spot that is difficult or impossible for them to reach themselves. Just think about how great it feels to us when we have an itch in the center of our back that we can't reach and someone offers to scratch it for us. It's like heaven, right? So what a gift when we can offer this to our horses to help them see that our touch is valuable rather than just something they have to tolerate. In fact, when we make a habit of using our touch in ways that are perceived as helpful to our horses, they will actually start to try and direct us, usually by positioning their bodies in relation to us in a way that makes it easy for us to reach an itchy spot. They might also try to be even more helpful, such as lifting a leg to give us access to a hidden spot, or mutual grooming to let us know when we've got it just right. If we make a habit of interacting with our horses when they are at liberty versus when they're tied or cross-tied, we give them the freedom to communicate more effectively with their body language. And this can be super fun for everyone because it really becomes a communication and a two-way interaction. Now, obviously, we can't always limit ourselves to only touching our horses at the times and in the ways they want it. But if the relationship with your horse is important to you, then making efforts to tip the scale more often in the direction of your touch being a positive experience for your horse, these efforts will go a really long way. And don't forget that from your horse's perspective, the highest expressions of trust, respect, and friendship come in the form of simply sharing space together without feeling a compelling need to touch at all. So I hope you have enjoyed today's video presentation and the whole series, To Observe Horses is to Know Horses. Congratulations on committing the time and energy to learn more about how to see things from your horse's perspective. I know it will pay huge dividends in the quality of your relationship. Don't forget that you can always visit my website at www.unbridled.guru for more information, including the link to my online resource room, which is filled with other valuable videos and articles to help you and your horse love your life together. Have a great day, and as always, may the horse be with you.